Hi everybody, it's Jason Barger back with another whiteboard session here as a part of the Entheos Academy. Great to be with you again. Today we're talking about designing your culture. Designing your culture and strengthening, your marriage, your relationships, your company culture, any kind of culture that you're a part of, and you've probably never even thought about how is it that you design the culture that you want to be a part of, and how do you strengthen that relationship or that culture every single day. The reality is that culture, this word culture, that there's a culture between every relationship and every group that we're a part of. And the fact of the matter is that culture is being created every single day by the habits that we form and the way that we relate to one another along the way. That the culture is always changing. So anytime you hear people saying that the culture is changing, well, the reality is, of course it is. It's changing every moment, every day, in every individual relationship that we have, but then also within our teams and our companies, that the culture is always changing. So the question is not, can you keep the culture from changing? The question is, do you want to play any role in defining what it becomes? Do you want to be a part of the process of proactively trying to design and create and participate in the creating and the strengthening and the developing of that culture that you're a part of? And so the very best marriages, the very best relationships, families, organizations that you may volunteer for, and certainly within every team and business and work environment, the culture is created by what each individual contributor brings to that every single day, and the habits that get formed every single day, every day, one after the other. That's how culture gets created. So I want to start out by giving an image to you. I don't know if you've ever, it seems an appropriate way to start, I don't know if you've ever thought about the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer, as you may know, what does it do? It reads the temperature in a room, right? And so if you come into a room, if the room is really hot, the temperature, the thermometer would tell you how hot it is. And if it was really cold, it would tell you it was really cold. And it fluctuates every single day by the temperature in the room. A thermostat sets the temperature of the room, right? You set the temperature to 72 degrees, and that way, if it starts to get too warm in the room, the thermostat helps bring the temperature down. If it's too cold in the room, it helps to bring it up, right? And so a thermometer reads the temperature in the room and fluctuates, and a thermostat helps set the temperature that you want. The reason why I'm using that image is because in many different teams and organizations and cultures, even individual relationship cultures, oftentimes we can operate out of a thermometer kind of thinking. That the culture really just becomes whoever's in the room. If the room's really hot, we all get hot. If the room's really cold, we all get cold. You've all been a part of a meeting, I'm sure, where depending on the people in that meeting, the temperature in the room can get really hot or it can get really cold. And so the culture just all day long is fluctuating up and down depending on who's in the room and what they're bringing to that relationship or to that encounter. And some organizations that's the way they operate, and every single day that's the way it is. Well, the very best when we talk about designing a culture and we talk about relationships that do this on an individual level, or teams and organizations that do this, on a very intentional level, the very best are the ones that are not operating like a thermometer, but are actually operating like a thermostat. And what I mean by that is that they're not perfect, and they don't, it doesn't always perfectly stay at that temperature. But they go through the process, which is what we're doing today, to begin to think about what is the kind of culture that they desire. How do they even articulate the kind of culture they want? And do they go through a process of identifying this is what the culture we want to be? These are the attributes of the kind of culture we want. Here are the actions that need to then follow and help create that culture. and they get really clear on what is that temperature that they're trying to set, so that then when the room gets too hot, the group is able to begin to bring the temperature down, and when the room gets too cold, the group and the culture of the group is able to bring the temperature up. So before we dive into designing our culture, I want you to pause just for a second, and I want you to think about a significant relationship. It may be your marriage, it may be a family relationship or a friend, or think about your team or your company, in your work life. And I want you to think about, what is the kind of culture that you want? And just take a second and try to write down some attributes that you would think about. How would you describe the kind of culture that you want for that group or that relationship? Pause for just a second. All right. Well, I want to invite you to continue to think about that throughout the rest of this class. But as we talk about defining culture, I talk to groups all the time that the way that I define culture, and I think the way that we begin to design cultures, and again, the very best examples of this within marriages or relationships, or certainly teams and organizations and company cultures, they're very intentional about what is the kind of culture that they're trying to create every single day. And they realize that culture is designed and created by the way that we think, act, and interact every single day. That's the way that culture gets created. You may not think about it this way, but with your relationship or with your company or your team that you work with every day, the culture is getting created every single day by the way that you think, the way that you act, and the way that you interact. And it's changing 1 second at a time every day as you enter the room. And so it begins with the way that we think. This is why, companies and organizations, this is why they create things like mission statements or core values. And they create a nice poster and they go through the exercise to try to come up with, how do we want our people to think when they enter the doors? Every morning when they get there and they come through the doors or they gather together, how do we want them to be thinking? How do we want them to frame up their mindset every time they come together for this relationship? And then it starts with being able to identify, well, what is the language that we would put to what kind of culture that we want? We have to be able to, if we can't articulate it, then we can't really even explain it to people. And so to go through the process of saying, for your relationship or for your team, what are those core values? Or what is that mission? How do we want to begin to think every time we come together? And that slowly over time, as we get more clear on how we want to think, every time we get together, it becomes more natural that that's just the way that we move throughout the world. That's the way that we naturally then think about the work that we're doing. Not just what we do, but how we show up to do it every single day. But then, as we also know, that poster on the wall, as beautiful as it may be, with all of the great, words of core values or the mission that we have for this relationship or this team or for this entire company, that it can't just be a beautiful poster on the wall. That then it starts with framing up how we're going to think, but then it has to lead to actions. For each individual contributor to this relationship or to this team or culture, the culture gets built by our own individual actions every single day. And so do I, as an individual contributor, and to the other people on the team, are we clear? What are the actions that are going to help bring those core values off of the wall and into action as a part of this culture that we're creating? And so if one of our core values is to be a collaborator, and we want to have a very collaborative environment, then we have to get really clear on what are actions that show collaboration, that encourage collaboration. We have to even begin to define, what do you mean and what do I mean when we say the word collaboration. Because if we don't have the same definition, then you may think you're a collaborator, but you're really not putting any of the actions into this culture that anchor what it really means to collaborate. And so we have to be able to start with the way that we think and be able to get clear as to how do we even want to design this culture, but then we have to get clear on how do we link that to specific actions individually, so that when nobody's watching and I'm a part of this, marriage or this relationship, or I'm a part of this company, that when nobody's watching and I'm going through my life or through my work every day, am I putting out the actions? Am I bringing not just what I do, but how I do it that is the best example of how we want that culture to be? Am I putting it into actions? And then lastly, after we are clear about how we want to think and are clear about linking it to those individual actions, it's about then how do we interact? That every single time in that relationship, every single time we show up and we interact with one another, the culture is either being supported and built and strengthened and being building and creating and getting stronger, or it's deteriorating. Because again, by the actions, it's either showing us that the way we want to think is coming to life, or it's undercutting and it's saying, I know we say that's what is most important to us, and we say that this is the culture that we want to create, but our actions and our interactions are not backing that up. And so every single day within your team or your company, and if you're a part of a huge organization, there are thousands or even millions of little interactions that are happening every single day that are either anchoring that culture that you want to create and strengthening it and developing it, or it's deteriorating it and making it harder to actually live and bring that culture to life. So culture is created one person at a time, one action at a time, over time, every single day, by the way that we think, by the way that we act, and then the way that we interact as participants in this culture. I was at Southwest Airlines, lucky to be at their headquarters in Dallas a little over a year ago. And the day I was there, we were going through, we were getting a tour of the facilities, and actually they were talking about their culture and the specifics of their culture and what makes them unique. And as we were talking about this, and I of course was very interested in this for the work that I'm doing in terms of developing and strengthening leaders and culture and clarity of mission and vision, absolutely interested in what they were doing. Well, there was one sign that day as they were talking about culture, like one poster that was literally everywhere. I mean, I'm talking about the same poster that was right next to the exact same poster all the way around the walls. So you had the same poster right next to each other all around the walls. The same image and the same message was in the middle of the table. There were people that had it on little name tags or buttons. I swear there were people that had it like tattooed on their foreheads. It was bizarre. But the reason why is because it was important. The message in big words was, count on me to own it. And in big words, own it. And then underneath, we are all ambassadors of our culture. We are all ambassadors of our culture. And the reason why this message was everywhere at Southwest Airlines was because they told the story that if you want to work at Southwest Airlines, that after you get through the many, many different interviews and vet the process, which a very small percentage of people, I guess, actually get a job, but once you get to that point where they're about to give you a job, they sit down with you and they take the job description for whatever role that you're applying for throughout this entire organization. They take the job description and they put it in front of you, and then they push it aside. And they say, yeah, we'll get to this eventually. But to be honest with you, it's really not what's most important. We can find anybody to do this, to actually accomplish these tasks and do this job. We can find somebody to do this. So we're not worried about that. We'll get to that, and we'll do the training, and we'll help make sure you can do this. But we're going to push that aside because, to be honest with you, what we want to talk to you about first is this. And then they put in front of them a one-page that explains their culture, the culture they're trying to create. And it has words on there that link to their core values as a company. And it talks about specific leadership actions that are going to help bring that to life. Because when we talk about leadership actions, not just people in leadership positions, but the fact that we are all leaders. And we all, again, contribute to the creation of this culture. And so they set that in front of them, and they say, if you want to work here, we have to be able to count on you to own it. Not rent it, not temporarily think this is a kind of a good idea, but we need to know that you're going to own it because we are all ambassadors of our culture. I love that image and I love that story because I think about my own cultures in my life and the ones that I'm trying to develop and strengthen and design in my life. I think about my marriage. I think about the culture between my wife and I. I think about the culture that I have with my 3 kids, and that there absolutely is a culture, that the habits and the environment that's being created every single day. I think about the teams and organizations that I'm lucky to serve and to collaborate and to be a partner with, and to try to develop and strengthen that culture. I think about all of those, and I realize that it starts with whether or not I believe and I'm going to truly own my end of the bargain. And to realize that I and all of us are ambassadors of our culture. And so I have to be the very best, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I have to be the very best ambassador for the culture between my wife and I, the culture with my kids, the culture with that team or organization that I'm lucky to serve or partner with. I have to be willing to not just rent it, but own it. Because we are all ambassadors. We all play a role in creating and designing the culture that we want to be a part of. So how do we do that? How do we begin to do that? There are a couple of pretty specific things that we need to make sure that we frame up our minds and as we begin to practice this and think about the big ideas of this class. One of them is we need to be intentional. That a lot of this starts with intentionality. It starts with us, oftentimes in our relationships or in our work lives, we are so quick to just go scatter, to just run in all different directions and just go accomplish things and get stuff done. But if we really want to design the culture that we want, it takes intentionality to step back and say, well, wait a second, before we rush off to that next event or that next, soccer practice or that next, company meeting or whatever project we're going to get next, let's step back for a second and let's intentionally take time to talk about how do we want to think. What is important to our relationship with this culture? How do we want to act? How are we committed to interact? So it starts with that intentionality, and of course it's not a one-time thing. It's not a one-time thing. That I say to groups all the time that leadership development and culture work is not a drive-through experience. It's not, I know we live in a culture where we want to go through the drive-through and we want to get it our way, right? I want the lettuce and tomato and you want the onion and the ketchup, or we want the cup of coffee exactly the way that we want it. I know we live in that culture, and I celebrate that, but the reality is that we can't just design a culture overnight. It takes intentional time and practice and a commitment over a longer period of time to come back to that and revisit how is it that we think, act, and interact, and then are we committed to the next piece of it. So another piece of this is that every time we come together or when we're intentional about taking time to be together is to make sure that we're taking time to celebrate the positives, within that relationship. So it's important for my wife and I to go out to dinner or to go, sit down every once in a while, go have a cup of coffee. It's important for our teams to come together every once in a while and sit together and say, hold on, before we jump to everything that's not working, or that even if it's working but needs some adjustments, let's start with how can we celebrate the positives that are happening? Because every time we celebrate the good things that are happening in that culture, it anchors it more deeply within the culture. It strengthens it, it lifts it up and says, yes, this is a great example of what we're talking about how we think, act, and interact. And so we have to take time to celebrate those positives. To do just that, I want you to pause for just a minute. This will be an intro pause. So pause for just a minute, and then after this class, I hope you'll pause a little bit more. But I want you to just write down the first 3 or 5 things that come to your mind of celebrating the positives about the culture that you're thinking about in your mind today. Just take a minute. All right, hopefully that was just an intro for you. I hope you carry that forward. But we have to make sure that we're taking time to celebrate those positives because, again, there's momentum that gets created within our culture. And we need to make sure that as we're celebrating those are the things that get anchored within the culture. The other thing, though, we have to be also honest about is we have to be willing to create an environment and a culture where we are honest about our shortfalls. Again, none of us are perfect. There are no individual contributors that are perfect as a part of this culture, even if it's at your company and your work, and the CEO is not perfect. And they may feel like they are at times, but we have to create a culture and an environment where we're not perfect. And part of that is being able to be honest about our shortfalls, honest about what are the places within our relationship or within the culture of this team or this, company. Where is it that we're falling short, or that we're maybe not bringing the best of that culture that we've written about on the wall? Where are we not living up to that? Or where are, a more positive way to say it is, where are there opportunities for development and for growth? And are we going to be willing to be honest about that and then get clear on, all right, together, here are the things we're going to work on. Here are the things I'm going to work on. Here's the things I'm going to own. And here are the things you're going to own. And together, we're more clear on these are the great things that are happening, and here are the things that where there's opportunity to grow and develop and strengthen this culture. The other part of this is that we have to build in time. Every time we come back together, every time we come together as a culture, every time we step back to, again, assess and think about how we think, act, and interact, that it ends with us being able to say, okay, well, what is that new vision? How are we going to recommit to that vision that we have? And to be able to pause for a second and look around the room and say, hey, just for a second, that poster we put on the wall, or at Southwest Airlines, that sheet I put in front of you, and I know it was 7 years ago that we committed to this, but what is it going to mean for me individually and us collectively to recommit to that vision? And am I and are you going to make that proactive decision to kind of renew that commitment, to re-up that commitment to each other, to renew that membership, if you will, and say, all right, here's what it's going to look like for us to get back on track and kind of recommit to what we said we we're going to do. And lastly, again, if you've been a part of any of my classes, you know that I love to end with the idea of having a bias toward action. I love that phrase because I think the way that we need to end any kind of session where we're talking about our own life and our own work and thinking about the person that we're trying to be in the world, the type of leader, the type of culture we're trying to create, that the appropriate way to end that is to say, what's going to be my or our bias toward action? And again, I'll make this distinction. I'm not talking about a bias towards busyness, where now you're running out of the room frantically trying to actualize 118 things, because the reality is you won't. And not all of the 118 things are most important anyway. But it is the intentionality of saying, what's going to be my 1, 2, or 3, what's going to be my bias toward action, the 1, 2, or 3 actionable things that I'm going to begin to do and change. What is it? What small action? If I need to walk down the hallway and go have a conversation that I've been putting off, I'm gonna do that. If I'm gonna schedule some time with that relationship or with my team to intentionally step back and think about some of this stuff, I'm gonna get it scheduled. If there's something that I need to read or think about in my own life to help bring more clarity to this, I'm going to schedule time to do that. So what's going to be your bias toward action so that as you think about designing the culture that you want to be a part of and strengthening that, that marriage or that team, that relationship, or that entire company culture, what's going to be your bias toward action? Thank you for being a part of today's class. Thank you for beginning this conversation about designing culture. I hope you'll check out some of the other classes that certainly I'm a part of with the Entheos Academy and all the other great classes that are here. If I can ever be of assistance to you, I hope you'll reach out. And if you're interested in more of what I'm doing, I hope you'll check out stepbackleadership.com, stepbackfromthebaggageclaim.com, bookremember.com, some of the other places where my content and books and resources are available. Thank you so much. Good luck with designing your culture, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.